The White House and the congressional leaders' offices are still trying to hammer out any potential areas of agreement. There needs to be a meeting early next week before President Biden leaves for Asia on Wednesday, if there's going to be any sort of agreement that can move forward in a timely manner before that June 1st default deadline. So far, Republicans have put forth 4 buckets: permitting reform, work requirements for people receiving Medicaid and food stamp benefits, clawing back some of the COVID aid, and then pursuing a deal to cap government spending for multiple years. I'm told permitting reform and those spending caps are 2 of the lowest hanging fruit for these negotiations. But of course, the devil, Kelly, is always in the details, and there's a lot of details there that need to be worked out. All of this while the Congressional Budget Office is saying, yes, early June is when the U.S. would in fact default, that if Treasury has to pay more than $300 billion in bills, that it won't be able to do it with the cash it has on hand, and it might not be able to make it to June 15th when more tax revenue comes in.
What, by the way, did CBO say today? Because I saw it seems like they're in the basket of we could still hit it in the first weeks of June. We missed that point. Maybe we, can hold out a little bit longer. And I also thought it was interesting what they said about the deficit and the debt. I mean, that's why we're in this situation to some extent in the first place.
Right. Well, it's sort of like a household budget, Kelly. If you could pay your water bill and your electric bill, but not pay your mortgage, not pay the bigger ticket item and conserve some of that cash, then maybe you could stumble along and make it work. But Treasury has never been in this position, and they're extremely conservative about how to do this. And there's certainly a lot of payments coming due: Social Security payments, veterans benefits, federal salaries, tens of billions of dollars that they'll need to pay. And June 15th is when the tax revenue comes in. CBO says if Treasury can make it to June 15th, then based on how much cash comes in from some of those tax receipts, maybe it could make it to late July without a default. But there's, of course, a lot of ifs in there and a lot of conditions on, what exactly Treasury decides that it can and must pay, and, what actually ends up coming in on June 15th.
Right, exactly. Ben, let me turn to you on that. So we obviously see investors pricing in a pretty high odds of default. And odds of default, what's interesting about that is that there's no reaction in the stock market, some extent of reaction in the bond market. But the fact that credit default swaps are now higher than we saw in 2011 without a market impact is striking.
It is striking, and it does show you that there are those in the market who understand that this particular debt limit standoff is much more complicated and difficult than the last couple since 2011, when we got downgraded by Standard & Poor's, and that was the first time in our history, and we got close to a default. The contours are there for that to happen again, given all that Kayla just said about the timing and getting to June 1 versus June 15 and the tax receipts. So the risk is there.
And tax receipts have been worse than expected. They were terrible in April. They were like $200 billion
Precisely.
Worth. May has been kind of soft, so that's kind of pushing us closer to that.
We're not getting better news on that front. So if anything, the deadline gets pushed forward a little bit. I still believe that there is a deal to be had here that will include some give back of the COVID money that hasn't been spent, permitting reform, and then a hike of the debt limit. Because I think Republicans know Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, needs to keep a speakership by getting something through that Republicans can support. But they know the polls. They know every time this happens, they get hammered for it and they get blamed for it. And there's new polling out today suggesting the public would blame Republicans for it.
But it's odd because it's sort of like there's 2 aspects of this. And there's who do you blame in a debt ceiling fight, but also what do you want to be done about spending and deficits? And so a lot of people would say, well, I want us to rein things and I want austerity. And that's where it feels like, and this is the point Dan Clifton keeps making, but all of this is really about, in 2011, when Obama raised the debt ceiling, he had to concede to significant austerity. And if we have to concede to any austerity now, it's at a pretty bad time for the economy.
Exactly. We can't really afford austerity cuts right now or big discretionary spending limits. And what was in the original Republican plan are pretty drastic cuts in discretionary spending if you take out the military, which they said they would. Economy can't really afford that. Republicans know that. That's not going to happen. There is a deal here, Kelly. It just needs to be made. And it's actually not a bad sign that they're not meeting today. That means staff is talking and there are details to be worked out. Get the principals together next week before Biden leaves and hopefully save our summer and that we don't have to be, driving to the beach and worrying about this in July, because I don't want to be.
Well, that said, Kayla, I thought the former President Trump's comments were quite interesting, where he took a really hard line on the debt ceiling issue the other night, said he thinks Republicans should push for huge spending cuts. And if that's any indication of where some of the public is on this, then perhaps we should be prepared for a bigger fight.
Yeah, and he also said that the country should just go ahead and default and see what happens, leaving some like Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, to call it irresponsible and say that's why, he doesn't trust him on matters like this. Look, I mean, Kelly, I think that there are real questions as to what the path forward is and how long these spending cuts can be agreed upon, because on one hand, there seems to be some rumblings that maybe 2 years is a time frame that the administration would try to push for. But just yesterday, some Republicans on the Hill have said, well, if it's only 2 years that we're capping spending, then we need to get a lot in return for that. The cost that we're going to exact, the price that we're going to exact is going to be really high for only 2 years. I mean, they want the curve of government spending to essentially be redirected downward, which is a really big change from recent trends. So, the question of how long the term is for any sort of spending caps deal still remains to be seen. Some Republicans have suggested that maybe default is a good thing. At least that's their public posturing, because they want to show the administration that they're not worried about it. But I think behind the scenes, they know that, it would be a bridge too far.